There are few places in this world quite as inhospitable as the roasting deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. Temperatures could creep up to 55 degrees Celsius during the summer, and only the hardy survive. Smack bang in the middle of this is a country that is both very old in terms of its culture, but very young in terms of its unification and modern borders. Within these borders, 95% of the nation is classified as a desert, but it also comes with some of the largest oil reserves on the planet. Saudi Arabia is a polarizing country. It's got the most important Islamic site on earth, the Masjid al-Haram mosque in Mecca, which draws pilgrims from across the world in staggering numbers. In 2019, an estimated 2.5 million people made their way to the dusty city in western Saudi Arabia, and that's slightly down on the record, which was in 2012, with roughly 3.1 million people in attendance. But the list of grievances against the country, especially by those with more, how shall I put it, liberalized Western ideals, is substantial. From human rights abuses, treatment of women, bombing of countries, allegedly murdering journalists, and a lot else, this country certainly has a few black marks against it. But I'm not going to sit here and regale you with a long list of negatives about Saudi Arabia because, well, you've probably heard it all before and it would get in the way of what's actually a rather fascinating story. You see, the rise of Saudi Arabia has been nothing short of unstoppable. For a nation that hasn't even celebrated its 100th birthday as a unified country, it today stands as one of the most powerful nations, not just in the region, but across the world. It is also a story with plenty of Game of Thrones-esque family intrigue, backstabbing, and even murder. We normally start these videos with some historical backgrounds and build from there, but today we're going to start with the present because Saudi Arabia is one country that many seem to mutter about, but few really understand what lies behind the scenes. As I just mentioned, Saudi Arabia is practically all desert. The country encompasses an area of 2.15 million square kilometers, which is roughly 3.5 times the size of Texas, and the Arabian Desert that lies at its heart accounts for roughly 95% of it. The country has a population of 34.2 million people, with 80% of those residing in the 10 major cities in the country. It's also one of the youngest populations in the world, with 50% of Saudi Arabians being under 25. Now, in the past, having a country with no rivers and where only 1.5% of the land was considered arable might have been a bit of a problem, but well, not anymore. You see, deserts might be bad for pale skin, ice cream, and most life in general, but below the surface lies something that has absolutely transformed this from a place once roamed predominantly by the hardy nomadic Bedouin to a global powerhouse in the space of less than 100 years. Saudi Arabia's Ghawar oil field is the largest in the world and has in the region of 75 billion barrels of oil left, which is enough to fill 4.7 million Olympic swimming pools, by the way. And it's probably not a great surprise to hear that petroleum accounts for roughly half of the country's GDP, and to be quite honest, pretty surprised that's not actually higher. The financial boom off the back of this vast under-desert cash cow has been staggering, although this has certainly been tempered in recent years with the crash in oil prices. They're in the process of building the tallest building in the world in Jeddah, with the Kingdom Tower expected to reach 1 kilometer, that's 0.6 miles in height, but work has been on hold since January 2018. Along with that are 6 vast economic cities that are pretty much being constructed from scratch across the country, which we'll come back to a little later in the video. So that's pretty much the state of affairs in Saudi Arabia today. So now let's jump back in time to put this all in a bit of context. As I said earlier, Saudi Arabia is both very young and very old. There is evidence of human settlement in the area, dating back 63,000 years, and fossils even suggest a potential migration through the region between 300,000 and 500,000 years ago. But geographically, things were very different back then, and the land through which early humans may have passed long ago is often referred to as Green Arabia, and I'm pretty sure you can guess why. In 570 AD, the child was born in Mecca who would eventually go on to be the most revered prophet of the Islamic faith. When he was around 40, Muhammad began preaching in the city, urging those around him to abandon polytheism and dedicate themselves to Islam. It was also around that same time that he began receiving revelations that he believed were coming from Allah, and his followers carefully transcribed these revelations into what is the Islamic holy book, the Quran. He and his companions were relatively successful at uniting the various tribes in the region under the single banner of Islam known as the Caliphate. Although after he died in 632 AD, a series of military engagements took place known as the Ridda Wars, in which rival factions slugged it out for supremacy. From here, Islam spread quickly, sometimes through peaceful means and sometimes through bloody war. In the space of just a few decades, the Persian Empire in the north had been destroyed and the Islamic world stretched from Spain to India. In terms of sweeping religious conquests, it was one of the most staggeringly successful in all of human history. The Umayyad Caliphate was overthrown in 750 AD. And for the next 700 years or so, the area that is today Saudi Arabia was a shifting sea of tribal coalitions. Loosely speaking, it remained part of various Islamic empires that came and went, namely the Abbasids of Baghdad, the Fatimids, Ayyubids, the Mamluks of Egypt. But with distances so vast and environments so hostile, it wasn't as if large armies were crawling back and forth in the region. In the 16th century, the area fell under Ottoman rule, and until the early 20th century, power swung back and forth between various Arab tribes and their Ottoman rulers. In 1744, we see the first glimmers of what would eventually be an independent Saudi state when a group of religious leaders joined together to form Wahhabism, which was an Islamic reform movement looking to return the religion to its purity and its roots. One man who became involved with this movement was Mohammed bin Saud, founder of the Emirate of Diriyah, broadly known as the first Saudi state, established in 1744 but destroyed by the Ottomans in 1818. In Wahhabism, Saud saw a movement that would be wise to attach his name to, and for a short period, things worked well. In the early 20th century, things were getting a little shaky for the Ottomans and their massive empire. While they technically controlled the Saudi Arabian area, in reality there was still plenty of infighting on the grounds between various rival groups, in particular the Al-Rashid and the Al-Saud. In 1902, Abdulaziz Al-Saud, leader of the Al-Saud and descendant of Mohammed bin Saud, returned from exile and took control of Riyadh, which at the time was still a long way from the large city that we see today. The conflict between the two sides increased, and things were made all the more confusing by the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule by some, but not all, of the tribes in the area. If you've ever seen the film Lawrence of Arabia, you'll know all about this period, and if you haven't and you want to find out more, you should see the movie. After the end of World War I, the final battle for Saudi Arabia took place, with Abdul Aziz Al Saud finally defeating his rivals. In 1926, he proclaimed himself king, and the following year, he was given the all-important vote of approval as the United Kingdom formally recognized him as the ruler of the region. In 1930, the two kingdoms of Hijaz and Najd were united as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and what we see today as the modern borders around the country were finalized. The battle for Saudi Arabia was over, and one family had emerged as rulers. But at this point, the young Saudi Arabia was, as it still is today, a vast expanse of desert. The Al Saud family had claimed victory, but there was little to no hint as to the extraordinary find that was about to transform not only the country, but the fortunes of the Al Saud family. Oil had already been found in Bahrain in 1932, and Al Saud granted economic concessions to the Standard Oil Company of California shortly after to begin test drilling in Saudi Arabia. By the end of the decade, it was becoming clear that not only did the country have oil, but it had an awful lot of it. World War II saw oil production jump as the Allies gratefully bought up the oil pumping from below the country. In 1939, Saudi Arabia exported $7 million worth of oil, about $133.3 million today, but by 1953, that number had shot up to $200 million per year, about $3.8 billion today. And let's just say that it's been steadily climbing ever since, except for a few recent fluctuations. In 1933, Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company, was formed, and in 1988 it was privatized, keeping all profits within the kingdom, whereas before they'd been shared. Over the years, several other oil or natural gas fields have been found throughout the country, making this barren desert kingdom one of the richest places on the planet. Now, who would have guessed that with such a torrent of money now pouring in, that it wouldn't take long for the family infighting to begin? When King Abdulaziz died in 1953, he was replaced by one of his sons, of which he was said to have about 37, Saud bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. Under the new king, spending became ever more lavish, and despite the huge riches thanks to the new oil fields, foreign borrowing gradually climbed ever higher. The country also started to take some tentative steps away from Wahhabism and towards modernization or liberalization, depending on your point of view on the topic, which added to the growing sense of instability and faith in the king's rule. In 1964, the royal family acted together to depose Saud bin Abdulaziz Al Saud and place his brother, Crown Prince Faisal, on the throne instead. He was shot twice in the head by his nephew, Faisal bin Mosaid bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, during a public engagement. The assassin was initially deemed insane, then not, and was finally convicted and beheaded in the square in Riyadh. And this is the point in the video when I remind you that I did say it got all Game of Thronesy. The motives behind this are still unclear to this day, with theories ranging from simple revenge for the deposition of the previous king, anger over his small allowance, or even a supposed travel ban placed on him thanks to his tendencies to indulge in activities out of the country that were frowned upon within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I bet you can probably guess what those activities were. From here, things calmed down a little, and King Faisal was followed by King Khalid and then King Fahd, who ruled the kingdom until 2005. During this period, economic development continued at a blistering pace, but it was an event in 1979 that left a painful mark on Saudi Arabia and caused it to lurch towards religious conservatism. On the 20th of November 1979, the unthinkable happened. At exactly 5 a.m., with as many as 50,000 people inside the Grand Mosque in Mecca, between 400 and 500 insurgents unveiled their weapons and quickly seized the entire complex, killing 2 policemen in the process. Most of the worshippers were soon allowed to leave, but the insurgents took up defensive positions and prepared for battle. The group that had taken over the holiest site in all Islam were led by a man called Muhammad Abdullah al-Qutani. He was calling for the overthrow of the Saudi royal family, which he claimed were corrupt, ostentatious, and had destroyed Saudi culture by an aggressive policy of westernization. He also firmly wanted a return to the original ways of Islam, which included the banning of television, the expulsion of non-Muslims, and, generally speaking, a much more hardline ideology. For nearly 2 weeks, Saudi special forces, being advised by French GIGN units, battled the insurgents and gradually forced their way inside, and on the 4th of December, the siege finally ended. The fallout was immense, with anger spreading well outside of the borders of Saudi Arabia. The response of the royal family was predictably severe. 68 insurgents who had survived were beheaded in 8 different cities across the country, but it was the social changes that would have the biggest impact on the country. While the actions in the Grand Mosque were seen as flagrant violations of the holy site, what came next actually swung Saudi Arabia further towards the kind of country that the insurgents had been demanding. Instead of cracking down on religious extremism, the Saudi royal family chose to pivot towards it as a way of keeping the peace and their control over the country. Things started slowly with photographs of women in newspapers being banned, then women on television. Next came the closure of cinemas and music shops, while the school curriculum was changed to add more religious studies. Gender segregation, already heavily prevalent, was taken up another notch, and the powerful religious police began enforcing the new laws with real zeal. To call the last 20 years in Saudi Arabia eventful might not quite do it justice. Its most notorious son, Osama bin Laden, became the most sought-after terrorist on the planet after the attacks of 9/11, and the fact that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi placed a huge strain on US-Saudi relations. When the Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2015, it appeared as if the United States was inching towards one of Saudi's biggest rivals in the region, and coincidentally, this was also the year that Saudi Arabia began obliterating Yemen in response to a rebel Houthi uprising. This was a country that it had consistent issues with over the decades, but considering the financial and military differences between the two, it was about as imbalanced as you're ever going to get. 6 years later, and with the death toll pushing 250,000, the war is still ongoing, and Yemen looks more like the 15th century than the 21st. Saudi Arabia is certainly a country in transition, though it's not entirely clear in what direction it's headed. The massive infrastructure projects going on in the country, in particular the 6 economic cities being built from scratch, will certainly change the country's landscape. The largest of these, King Abdullah Economic City, located on the east coast, is set to spread to 173 square kilometers and should be finished soon, with a cost in the region of $27 billion. It's hoped that the city will generate up to 1 million jobs while helping to diversify the country's economy away from oil. Exactly where the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is heading is up for debate. Will Riyadh become the next Dubai, or will we see the royal family once again retreat behind the banner of religion and consolidate power. The country seems to be doing its best at showcasing tentative steps towards some sort of liberalization at least, but in truth, there is a long way to go, and it's not clear how far the royal family are willing to allow such liberal ideas to filter down into society. In recent decades, the country has attempted to rein in its lavish spending, which has included some of the highest levels of wealth for anywhere in the world, but trying to keep its restless population happy seems to be getting considerably harder. So I really hope you found today's video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. As always, thank you for watching.